Terry, for that lovely introduction. I'm used to giving sleep-deprived talks on epilepsy and epilepsy genetics sort of anywhere in the world, but I find this actually quite a daunting task. Today we celebrated Frank's scientific contribution. I think everybody agrees it was a wonderful day, and we're really grateful to our international and national speakers who came. And it's really a daunting privilege as one of Frank's students now to talk about Frank the person and his humanitarian work. We're all shaped by history and experiences, and sometimes these sublimate in actions in quite remarkable ways. Frank was born in Budapest, Hungary 80 years ago, 14th of October 1935. A terrible time for European Jewry, with worse to come. In 1938, the first anti-Jewish laws were passed in Hungary, and the screw gradually began to turn. The atrocities gradually increased, and in mid-1944, under the terrible regime of Adolf Eichmann, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, including Frank's father. He was deported to Auschwitz, and sadly that's where Frank and my story somewhat intersect. My father was also there and thankfully survived, but many of his family died, and Frank's father was also murdered. Frank lived in a protected house, the Alice Weiss Hospital in Budapest. As we've heard today, he was taken to be executed with 20 women from the hospital to the barracks in October 1944 by the Arakroth, the Hungarian version of the SS, and that was for the crime of removing the yellow star. He was lined up in front of a machine gun, and he was saved and returned to the safe house as a person under neutral protection by the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who with his colleague Perunga did amazing things by issuing protective passports, or so-called schutzpasses, which identified the bearers as Swedish subjects. Really not strictly legal documents, but they worked, and Wallenberg was an amazing and courageous person. And he saved tens of thousands of people. He rented buildings in Budapest and called them the Swedish this and the Swedish that, and saved an enormous number of people that way. Frank was forced to line up for selection in January of 1945. He hid in his wardrobe while members of his family were taken by the fascists and murdered by being shot into the River Danube. Many of you have visited that wonderful city of Budapest, a beautiful European city, and many of you will have seen the stirring and disturbing memorial of shoes lined up by the water, and that's the memorial to people that were shot in the Danube in very large numbers. The surviving members sought out Raoul Wallenberg, but he was unable to intervene, and he disappeared on the 17th of January 1945, shortly before the liberation of Budapest. The fate of Wallenberg is uncertain. Frank may tell us a little more about that later. It was initially said by the Soviets that he died in 1947, and it's pretty clear that was untrue. And it seems he was probably alive in the 1980s. 35 members of Frank's family were murdered in the Holocaust. He remained in Hungary. He began his high school education there in the period 1946 to 1949. And he escaped from Hungary in August of 1949, briefly via Austria, and he came to Australia in 1951, where he completed his education at Melbourne High School, went on to study medicine at the University of Melbourne, and you've heard more about that earlier. I first met Frank as a medical student at the Austin around 1976. I was a fifth-year student. He was an active clinical academic, a patient and devoted teacher, and I fondly remember our tutorial groups within his very messy office on level 5 of the Townsend building at the Austin. Medicine, research and teaching seemed to be the things that drove this cultured and highly intelligent European bloke, and he was inspiring to be with. Our shared Jewish heritage was an extra bond, but really the business at hand was medicine and later neurology. Although Frank was always a product of this and his history, and he clearly had an intense interest in the Holocaust, in about 1982 he became aware of the intricacies of the disappearance of Wallenberg, who had personally saved him, and his likely imprisonment in the USSR. And I understand that happened after a BBC film. And this transformed Frank and drove him into action. I was training in neurology at that time in the early 80s, beginning my MD, which Frank co-supervised with wise and reasoned judgment, and I'm always grateful to him for guiding me through those early parts of my research career. And I must say, I was puzzled by his seeming obsession with Wallenberg. I have the so-called second generation Holocaust syndrome, where one is protected by one's parents from discussing it, and one didn't overtly acknowledge that this kind of shaped one's life, and it kind of wasn't part of it. And I remember now, to my shame, and it was to my shame, of wondering why Frank was so obsessed by this. And I remember this troubling me at the time, but with some passing years it's become clear why. Frank founded and chaired the Raoul Wallenberg Committee from 1982. He had Sir Zelman Cowen, for our international guest, a very prominent Jewish Australian who became Governor General. And he had many prominent Australians, including ex-Prime Ministers and the then Chancellor of the University, Sir Douglas Wright, as sponsors. And since then, he's worked tirelessly for the Wallenberg cause, and it's impossible to list all the work that he's done. He's gone every year or so to Sweden. He's testified in the US Congress Human Rights Committee in Washington. He was invited speaker on Swedish television at Wallenberg's 75th birthday celebration in '87. As has already been mentioned, he established the Wallenberg Gardens in Kew and had a statue commissioned, which is there. He's lectured at universities, at schools, at civic functions in Australia, in Sweden, in the US and elsewhere. He translated 2 books on Wallenberg. And one of them was the preface was written by Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. He's written hundreds of articles and petitions, and as we've heard, he established the Australian Centre for Clinical Neuropharmacology at St Vincent's, which was named the Raoul Wallenberg Centre as a living memorial. He's been widely recognised for his championing of the Wallenberg cause, particularly in Sweden. He was the keynote speaker at the funeral of Per Unger, who was Wallenberg's right-hand man and also a very heroic figure who worked with Wallenberg in Budapest, but thankfully survived. And he was awarded the Royal Swedish Order of the Polar Star by the King of Sweden in 2003 for his work. Also remarkably, he was invited in 2012 to a Vatican symposium entitled Courage in the Face of Evil, which was the 100th anniversary of Wallenberg's birth. Wallenberg was made an honorary citizen of the US, Canada and Israel, as we heard earlier, and Frank was determined to have Australia bestow this honour as well. This is a particularly un-Aussie thing to do, and a thing that one wouldn't thought was terribly likely. But Frank stuck at it. He had quite a few goes, and in 2013, in a remarkable letter to Senator Bob Carr, then the Foreign Minister, he hit the spot. He garnered wide support from prominent people in academia, in both sides of Parliament, and as Steve remarked in his close, this was really a very moving occasion when Wallenberg was made, in 2013, the first, and I still believe only, honorary citizen of Australia. Frank, we're all the richer for having known you, myself as both a student, a scientific colleague, and for learning about your amazing work in this field. The world needs people like you to bring important issues like Wallenberg to our consciousness, and we all salute you. Happy birthday, Frank, and can we all rise and drink to Frank? To Frank. Hello, Frank.